In the early part of 1862, the Union Army launched one of the most advanced naval ships ever seen by the likes of man. The USS Monitor was one of the first ironclads in history, seconded only by the CSS Virginia. The Monitor is classified as an armored turret gunboat. She weighs in at approximately 987 tons and was built at New York under the design from John Erickson. The Monitor's arch nemesis was destined to be the CSS Virginia of the Confederate Navy. The day the two met would forever be remembered as the Battle of the Ironclads. The Monitor's mission after its launch was to engage the CSS Virginia that was wreaking havoc on the Union Navy in Hampton Roads. By the time the Monitor arrived, the CSS Virginia had already sunk 2 Union warships. When the two finally engaged, a slugfest between the two iron behemoths ensued for hours, until both eventually pulled out. It must have been hard to imagine what it was like for the crew of the two vessels to endure intensive bombardments in hot, humid conditions with barely any circulation. This is the story of the men who risked it all, fighting for what they believed in. Life on board the Monitor was very different for the crew than it would have been on any other Union warship at the time. The turret and several feet of decking were all that was visible above the waterline. For the majority of the crew's time on board, they were below decks. If one could imagine an enclosed ship with nearly non-existent circulation, amid cramped quarters with men who are rarely given the opportunity to bathe. While the ship was underway, the only way to look outside was through the pilot house. If and when she was not underway, the crew opened up several hatches for increased light and circulation of fresh air. The living quarters on board the USS Monitor differed greatly between the officers and enlisted men. The crew consisted of about 56 seamen, including a few African Americans and 7 officers. On board the Monitor, it was unlikely that the officers would associate with the enlisted men very often. The seamen all slept in the same area, called the berth deck. The berth deck was a 16 by 25 foot room located in the center of the ship. The officers had much nicer and spacious private rooms with amenities they would find at home. The captain's room was the finest of them all. His private stateroom had its own bath, rosewood walls, mohair cushions, and plenty of room compared to the other men. The officers had 2 bathrooms to share, while the enlisted crew members were forced to share one. Erickson developed a state-of-the-art toilet system that could deposit the waste below the surface of the water, which was activated by levers. This design feature was essential for the crew, who would be unsafe on the deck of the ship while trying to relieve themselves from the necessities of life. On board the ship, the officers and enlisted men had 2 very different schedules. The enlisted men started their day around 6 a.m., manning the engine room, shoveling coal, maintaining the boiler and other various positions until about 7 p.m., when they would usually go to sleep. As for rations, they started off decent, but they deteriorated with time. George S. Greer summed it up best in his letter. A piece of salted beef regularly makes its appearance with the call for dinner. It appears in the form of hash for supper and is rehashed for breakfast the next morning. If vegetables exist in any portion of the civilized world, they are intangible to us. He also pointed out the problem that existed to maintain efficiency. There are 2 great evils in both our Army and Navy, which, if corrected, would render them more efficient. The first is whiskey. The second is whiskey, and the third is whiskey. Men of war do enjoy their spirits. The officers would wake up at around 7:30 and would stay up later, enjoying more social time and time to themselves. Life on board the ship could be very uncomfortable during the summer. The temperatures would reach on board this enclosed ship at around 140 degrees. During such heat waves, the crew would also have to deal with swarms upon swarms of mosquitoes, who would regularly eat any sailor alive. During storms, the waves would wash on board and large swells would let water in through the turret. The executive officer explained the force of the swell after one storm, saying, "The berth deck hath leaked in spite of all we could do. The water came down under the turret like a waterfall. It would strike the pilot house and go over the turret in beautiful curves. It came through the narrow eye holes of the pilot house with such force as to knock the helmsman completely round the wheel." Life on board the Monitor was definitely no vacation or home away from home. The men were forced to live in squalid, substandard conditions during the voyage. From intense heat, to hordes of pests, to the ravages of the storm-ridden sea, these men knowingly sacrificed a better life to help ensure the sanctity and preservation of the Union while serving on the Monitor.